As you know, heart failure is a very, very important problem entity in cardiology and also in general practice. And though the term itself connotes fear in the minds of the patients, it is only a definition that is made. Heart failure does not mean that it is end of life or something like that. So always when we write a diagnosis of a heart failure, we have to tell the patient and reassure that it is not a death sentence or something like that, which comes immediately. There are several treatment options and also interventional options in current day practice for management of heart failure. So the scope of today's discussion is we'll discuss a little bit about the definition, and then classification is there. We'll also go a little bit about the pathophysiology, then how to evaluate, and then medical management, then device therapy. Cardiac transplantation is the latest in the armamentarium of therapy, and also about preserved ejection fraction a little bit, and strategies to reduce burden, and also patient education and empowerment. So these are the learning objectives. So the definition is heart failure is a clinical syndrome characterized by typical symptoms, that is breathlessness, ankle swelling, and fatigue that may be accompanied by signs caused by a structural or functional cardiac abnormality, resulting in a reduced cardiac output and or an elevated intracardiac pressure at a rest or during stress. That is the European Society definition. I think if you split these things sentence by sentence, you can understand it's a clinical syndrome. Heart failure mostly is a clinical diagnosis. Typical symptoms, as you know, breathlessness, and then ankle swelling and fatigue because it's a low output state, and may be accompanied by signs. This is elevated JVP, the pulmonary crackles, and peripheral edema caused by a structural and or functional cardiac abnormality. Structural means there is a LV dysfunction or a problem with the structure of the heart. Functional means there is an impairment of the cardiac contractility resulting from inflammation or infection or ischemia, resulting in a reduced cardiac output. That is the fundamental thing. Actually, the cardiac output is decreased, and if the cardiac output is still maintained, it is maintained so at an elevated intracardiac pressure. And then HFSA definition is a syndrome caused by cardiac dysfunction, generally resulting from myocardial muscle dysfunction or loss characterized by either LV dilatation or hypertrophy or both. This is a more simplistic thing, but I think I like the European because it is giving in detail what are the symptoms, what are the signs, and basically what's happening in the definition, because the definition should encompass all the features. Acute decompensated heart failure means acute de novo heart failure defined as those patients who are admitted for the first time with HF and not previously known to have heart failure. That is ADHF. Then we have acute on chronic HF defined as a sudden worsening requiring admission in a patient known to have HF previously. That is acute on chronic heart failure. The clinical classifications are systolic heart failure with reduced ejection fraction where the cutoff is 40% below, and diastolic heart failure where the ejection fraction is preserved and the ejection fraction is more than 50%. So if you make out the differences between reduced and preserved ejection fraction, here the cardiac muscle is weakened, but here the muscle is hypertrophied. The heart is enlarged in size in reduced ejection fraction, but here it is normal. And here it is inability of the heart to relax and fill, whereas here it is the impairment of the systolic function. So heart is unable to pump out the blood. It is able to fill, but not able to send it out. Here it is able to have a problem in filling actually here. Sending is not a problem. So these are major differences between the HFrEF and HFpEF, we call it. And to make the things complicated, we have one more thing called mid-range ejection fraction, which defines those between 40 and 49%. It's a gray area, and sometimes people who have a reduced ejection fraction may improve and come into mid-range, and similarly people who have a more than 50% ejection fraction may come down into the lower also. So it can vary, and therefore the mid-range is a gray zone. So here again the symptoms and signs are more or less like a preserved ejection fraction. I think in my opinion, it's better to stick to those two, reduced ejection fraction and preserved ejection fraction. That is enough. because by this hair splitting, we are not going to achieve much in the terms of management. Now, this New York Heart Association classification is well known to all of us. There are 4 classes. This entails uniformity when we describe the patient's condition to any other medical professional or for documentation purpose. NIH-1 is asymptomatic. NIH-2 is symptomatic with moderate exertion. 3 is symptomatic with minimal exertion, and 4 is symptoms at rest. So these are NYHA classes. So suppose someone says he is NYHA class 4, it is understood that he is very sick. Now briefly about the epidemiology. We don't have much of data except one study from Trivandrum. And there is a high mortality, 32% die within 1 year. That is almost 1/3 of the people die in the first year, and half of them die by 5 years. Mortality is high in India because early diagnosis is not made. And if you compare the Western world, we still have a lot of young people, at least by a decade or a decade and a half, we have the heart failure. So we look at the age distribution. Here there is a ADHERE US registry. You can see almost equal distribution among ages from 65 onwards. But whereas in India, the data is available from Trivandrum registry, you can see almost 60% of the population is less than 65 years of age. And more than 85 is 4% only. Maybe because these people are not cared for, or people don't live that long, the population is not that much, those who come to 85 years of age. But alarming thing is here, people who are less than 65 years of age have a heart failure incidence of 57%. Now the etiology: ischemic heart disease, dilated cardiomyopathy, valvular heart disease, rheumatic and non-valvular, congenital, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and restrictive cardiomyopathy sometimes we encounter. And these diseases like hypertension and diabetes, all of them finally end in heart failure. So we have to educate the patients the need for continued monitoring and also control of risk factors like hypertension and diabetes. Otherwise, they may end up in the heart failure through ischemic heart disease or dilated cardiomyopathy. Etiology of heart failure, if you compare, ischemic etiology is 72%, dilated cardiomyopathy about 15%, rheumatic heart disease is only 7%, though previously we thought rheumatic heart disease will be more. Here it is not so. Other things about 2%. So acute heart failure outcomes, if you look at it, the in-hospital mortality is almost double when compared to the US or Europe. It's about 8%. And potential reasons for this are lack of evidence-based treatment, accessibility and affordability issues, and late presentation. Like people with acute MI, they present late to the hospital, and there are lack of treatment facilities. The infrastructure is not uniformly distributed equally across the country, and more so now when a pandemic like COVID is going on, these things are glaringly seen. As you know, in the papers and TVs, we are seeing the failure of the hospitals, especially the government machinery. Heart failure mortality at 1 year, if you see from the Trivandrum registry, it is 31%. And in US ADHERE registry also, it is 31%. That means about 1/3 of the patients who present with a heart failure are dead by 1 year, and by 5 years, half of them are dead. So this is a very important thing. We have to make an early diagnosis in the first year itself and put them on appropriate medications, because there are so many good medications like beta blockers or AC inhibitors or new class of compounds like ORNI and MRAs. All these things are going to decrease the sudden cardiac death incidence in the patients with a heart failure. Now, this is called guideline-based medical treatment, or GDMT we call it. All the patients with a heart failure should be on ACE inhibitor, ARB or ORNI, and a beta blocker, and then aldosterone blocker, like aldosterone blockers like spironolactone or eplerenone. So many of the times, patients are not on these 3 drugs. And I insist on my fellows and people who are trained under me to make sure that the patient compulsorily is on these drugs. And if he's edematous, then a diuretic should be added. Other things for control of diabetes, etc., equally important. Only 25% of the patients with LV systolic dysfunction received optimal treatment at discharge from the Trivandrum HF registry. I think it is because of the physician's inertia. maybe a lack of knowledge or lack of initiative to start all these drugs at the time of admission in the hospital. In fact, the hospital admission time is the best time to start this treatment because the patient is receptive, and we also can monitor the patient hemodynamics. For example, if you start the patient on ACE inhibitor or ARB, we can monitor his serum creatinine, we can monitor their potassium when he's in the hospital. Similarly, with the aldosterone blockers. Now, if you start the patient on beta blocker, you can assess for a hypotension, or you can assess for any ECG changes that occur. And therefore, it's very important to start the patients on these three essential medications, I would call them. We have to start these three, otherwise your prescription is not complete. Long-term survival data, 70% survival at 1 year. We already seen that 30% are dead by 1 year. So the remaining 70 is the survival, and 50% survive at 5 years, 10% survival at 10 years. So it's a very bad actually. As the time goes on, within 10 years, almost 90% of the people are dead. And if you look at the Indian data, 1 year survival is 70%, 3 year survival 55, and 5 year survival is 50%. So it more or less parallels with the Western data. Because it is a hard data, it is almost the same. And very important is this 10-year survival of 10%. So I think now you understood how bad it is. Once a diagnosis of a heart failure I made initial statement that we are not giving a death sentence on the patient. But if you go by these numbers, it looks almost we are giving a death sentence on the patient when we proclaim that the patient is having heart failure. So this is very important because we have seen there are several shortcomings in the management. Only 25% of the people are on optimal treatment. And maybe those are the reasons why these patients' survival is dismal. But if appropriate medications and appropriate measures are instituted, they may live longer and they may live with less hospitalizations. So these two are very important goals in the management of heart failure, not only symptomatic relief, but also providing them a decrease in the hospitalizations, and secondly, the decrease in the mortality. So economic impact is too much. If a patient is hospitalized, then it's very difficult. So we have to avoid hospitalizations, and therefore the medication should be given properly. Compared to data from West, Indian patients are younger by a decade. Males are more affected, more have coronary disease, higher in-hospital mortality. We have already seen that. About 8.9%, that is approximately 9% or so. And 1 year mortality is 31%, 3 year mortality is 45. So guideline-based medical therapy should be learned, encouraged, and practiced. Now we go to the pathophysiology. Compensatory mechanisms tries to restore the cardiac output. We have two things: neurohormonal system, that is the renin-angiotensin system, which is very important. We also have natriuretic peptides. Understanding these natriuretic peptides is important because it entails us to understand about the new drug, that is ARNI. Autonomic nervous system, increasing the sympathetic nervous system activity is very important. Initially, it is protective. So when the patient's heart is unable to contract, there is a more adrenaline in the body. So this adrenaline, norepinephrine, they are trying to increase the contractility. They do it by two things. One is they increase the pressure, contractility increases, and they also increase the heart rate. So initially it's okay. The heart is unable to produce enough cardiac output. When the heart rate increases, the blood pressure is increasing, the contractility is increasing, then the cardiac output increases. But over a period of time, it is not good. So continuously, if the heart is stimulated, it fails and it leads to further problems. And therefore, the role of beta blockers comes here in the management of heart failure. So here, a beneficial pathophysiological response, natriuretic peptide, neprilysin is one thing, inactive fragment, that is vasodilation. And then here in the renin-angiotensin system, we have angiotensin 2, which acts through angiotensin 1 receptor, produces vasoconstriction, increase in blood pressure, sympathetic tone, increase in aldosterone, increase in sodium, and fibrosis. These are the compensatory mechanisms, but over a period of time, they prove very expensive to the heart. So here is a cartoon which explains what happens in the systolic failure and diastolic failure, previously called as those terms. Now we call HFrEF and HFpEF. So here in the normal condition, the ventricle fills good, and also ejects about 60% of the blood. But in systolic dysfunction, the ventricle you can see is dilated. It is filled with blood, but it is unable to pump. It's only 40 to 50% or even less. In diastolic heart failure, the stiff ventricle, you can see here, there is a hypertrophy. There is a less blood that fills into the ventricle, and ventricles pump out 60% of the blood, but the amount may be lower than normal. Now, symptoms, I think all of us know from our days of house surgery and medical schools. We divide it into two, actually, left heart failure and right heart failure. Left heart failure is because of decreased cardiac output and then pulmonary congestion. And you can see impaired gas exchange. The patient will have less tissue perfusion, cyanosis, and signs of hypoxia. Pulmonary edema produces orthopnea, PND, and cough with frothy sputum. Right heart failure leads to dependent edema and ascites, and then gastric congestion leading to anorexia, GI distress, weight loss, etc. Liver congestion leads to signs related to impaired liver function. The patient has a tender liver, and then the liver enzymes go up. The patient may be icteric, anorectic, and all these things. So it is a constellation of symptoms of both right heart failure and left heart failure. Technically, though we separate left and right, both go together. When one fails, the other will automatically fail. So how do you evaluate a patient with a heart failure? Symptoms, the breathlessness, orthopnea, and PND, reduced exercise tolerance, fatigue, etc., ankle swelling, and more specific are JVP, hepatojugular reflux, and then third heart sound, laterally displaced apical impulse. A history is very important. We can see progressively increasing symptomatology, pulmonary congestion because of dyspnea, PND, orthopnea, cough, hemoptysis, systemic congestion, dependent edema, ascites, liver congestion, jaundice. In the late stages, we can see ascites. By then, actually, the patient is very moribund, cachectic, may not survive. Physical examination, we see cold peripheries, pulse rate is high, respiratory rate is high, urine output is less, blood pressure may be low, cardiomegaly, you can see third heart sound, definitely we can auscultate. There is what is called as a gallop rhythm, S1, S2, and S3 together. Elevated JVP, dependent edema, and if you auscultate the lungs, you have fine crepitations. And daily weight monitoring is very important. Abdominal girth for ascites. Actually, nowadays, I don't think we have the tape and all in our aprons to measure the abdominal girth. But daily weight monitoring, we insist on seeing the patients because that is an indirect evidence whether the patient is decongesting or accumulating fluid. So weight monitoring is very important for people who are discharged home also. We have to encourage them to do a daily weight monitoring. So weight is important parameter. The rate indicates the severity of the disease. It's a prognostic marker. More than 100 is bad. And if it is further high, it is bad. The blood pressure, the patient having low blood pressure, it's bad. Respiratory rate, tachypnea, and cardiomegaly, JVP, all these things indicate that the patient is having a failure. And nowadays we have the 6-minute walk test. It is useful to assess the prognosis. And even for COVID recovery also, we are using the 6-minute walk test. The patient has to have a watch on and walk for 6 minutes and then come back. If he is symptomatically better without much dyspnea, he's okay. Some case examples, 50-year-old female attending OPD as a diabetic since 10 years, known case of hypertension and hypothyroidism, effort-related dyspnea since 4 months and is gradually in onset, now worsened to class 3. She also complains pedal edema in the last 2 weeks. What is the probable diagnosis? So automatically you have to think of congestive cardiac failure because the patient is diabetic, hypertensive, hypothyroid, progressive shortness of breath, and leading to class 3 symptoms along with pedal edema. It is the heart failure. So probably it's a diabetic cardiomyopathy or ischemic cardiomyopathy. Here is an X-ray. You can see there is a cardiomegaly and there is some pulmonary congestion as well. Second case, 35-year-old male manual laborer attends the casualty. He has no history of hypertension or diabetes. He's a non-smoker. Complains of dyspnea on exertion last 2 days. He has acute worsening symptoms and is admitted with severe dyspnea. URTI of 2 weeks ago, he took paracetamol and felt symptomatically better. I think it goes with acute decompensated heart failure because previously he is not known to have heart failure and presented with severe dyspnea and heart failure. Cause could be myocarditis. There is a history of URTI. So infection can spread to the heart and produce myocarditis. That is what we see here. The patient has myocarditis, could be viral, could be bacterial or anything. Patient has ventricular dysfunction and pulmonary edema. The diagnosis is called ADHF, acute decompensated heart failure. You can see here grossly congested lungs. Here, the bat swing appearance, we call it. It is mostly hilar congestion that we see with the pulmonary edema here. And in COVID, we see those GGOs in the periphery. It is different. So nowadays, it's very important to differentiate on X-ray, whether it's a COVID X-ray or a heart failure X-ray, though we can treat COVID. This is the ECG which shows sinus tachycardia, and there is nothing much I can appreciate here, but there is definitely sinus tachycardia. Third case is a 29-year-old female, young lady with no risk factors. She had normal vaginal delivery 3 weeks ago. Now complains of dyspnea 1 week and gradually progressive and now class 3 mild pedal edema. So I think the term itself is very clear. Postpartum presenting with heart failure. So the possibility is postpartum cardiomyopathy or peripartum cardiomyopathy, otherwise called as PPCM, which is a known diagnosis. Either before delivery or immediately after delivery, they present with a heart failure. So this is PPCM. So it's a clinical diagnosis we have to confirm by some investigation. So detailed history remains the single best diagnostic tool. As always, I keep on saying in medicine, the patient will give you the diagnosis. Only thing is you should have a patience to hear what he is telling instead of cutting him down and trying to put our own words into his mouth. So the patient will give you the diagnosis. Etiology can be ascertained from history. Example, CAD, he will give risk factors. There may be a history of cancer chemotherapy that also shows that there is a chemotherapy-induced cardiomyopathy, long-standing hypertension or diabetes. They're all self-explanatory things. You don't have to apply a lot of brains to make a diagnosis. The etiology is very clear. But basic investigation should be done like hemoglobin, CBP, ESR, blood sugar, serum creatinine, electrolytes, and thyroid, ECG, chest X-ray, and echocardiography. By far, echocardiography becomes the most valuable tool in making a diagnosis of a heart failure. It also helps you to differentiate whether it is a heart failure with preserved ejection fraction or whether it's because of a reduced ejection fraction. It also will give you the diagnosis in terms of whether there is a ischemic etiology, whether there is a old MI or WMA or a valvular disease or there is a dilated cardiomyopathy. All the things are very clear by doing an echocardiography. In my opinion, if you ask me one single investigation, which is the most important in management of heart failure and also arriving at a diagnosis, I would say echocardiography. But you have to correlate with the symptoms. See, if you do an echo and find out that the patient is having an ejection fraction of 20%, that does not mean that the patient is having a heart failure. Patient may be fine. His BP is okay. He's 100. He's stable. He's able to walk. He can do his daily chores, totally asymptomatic with a severe LV dysfunction. Several people come to us like that. Or sometimes they are picked up by other colleagues when they go for some other problem. So always the important thing is to put the history. History should be correlated with the investigation. Then only you will arrive at a proper diagnosis. Otherwise, echo is in one direction, the clinical diagnosis is in another direction. The management is haywire. So we have to also look for ECG. It is also useful. Most common things you need is to look for the rhythm. Atrial fibrillation is a common thing. Multiple VPCs can produce LV dysfunction. And then evidence of CAD can be there in the form of Q waves on the ECG. And a chamber effect may be found out like LAO pattern or the RBB, LBB, those things may be there. Out of them, LBB is indicator that there is a myocardial dysynchrony. The heart muscle fibers are not synchronously contracting when you have an LBB. And for these people, if the LBB is long, and then we can put in a device. Sinus tachycardia, you can see here, and some Q waves are seen. Probably it is an ischemic etiology, maybe old inferior MI. So these are the things which we should look at. And here atrial fibrillation. Sometimes what happens, patient is stable and he comes to you with a failure. So just palpate the pulse. If you find irregular pulse with a fast heart rate, the patient might have developed a recent onset atrial fibrillation, and that might have precipitated the heart failure. So you can do a rate control, then give him medications, he should be all right. This is a typical left bundle branch block. We can see LBB is indicator of myocardial dysynchrony, and we can see often in dilated cardiomyopathies this kind of ECGs, and these people may develop by putting they may become all right if you put a device. Left ventricular hypertrophy is another thing. The etiology can be because of underlying aortic stenosis in elderly people, or hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, or a long-standing hypertension. So if you find someone with this kind of ECG, especially in elderly people, always suspect and auscultate here for a ejection systolic murmur. The person may be having aortic stenosis and producing LVH on the ECG. And as I said, echo is going to differentiate. Here we have a right axis deviation, right ventricular hypertrophy. Maybe a pulmonary hypertension can present like this, and also as a heart failure. Chest X-ray is important. You can see cardiomegaly, features of pulmonary venous hypertension, cardiac enlargement, valve or pericardial calcification, lung pathology, and pleural effusion also. So chest X-ray is also a very important tool in the evaluation of a heart failure. In ICUs, all the time we do it. Here you can see that there is a large heart shadow, so, and with a narrow pedicle, and this globular heart, we call it, it is like a globular or flask. So I think here is the diagnosis of a pericardial effusion should be considered in this case. And then echocardiography will confirm if there is a large pericardial effusion and tamponade. We put a needle and aspirate the pericardial effusion and send for analysis. So I think this is an X-ray of a pericardial effusion. And here you can see this calcification is there. In the previous X-ray, you have seen the heart is enlarged. Here you are able to see that the heart is small. And here it is encased by this calcification, which indicates that there is a chronic pericardial problem or a pericardial pathology. This diagnosis here is a constrictive pericarditis. So in constrictive pericarditis, the patient may present with the same symptoms. He will have edema, he will have ascites, shortness of breath, JVP, which is elevated. There are subtle features by which you can differentiate, but good thing is this is a completely treatable condition. So if you surgically strip this calcified pericardium, the heart will again expand, and the patient does well. Most often this is because of tuberculosis, which is common in our country. So always remember this diagnosis. A routine X-ray will give you a lot of information. Never undermine the X-ray. Nowadays we are advanced to HRCT, especially with the COVID. Everyone gets a HRCT chest, but nevertheless a simple tool like an X-ray is very valuable in clinical practice. Another X-ray where you see multiple contours of the heart, so that means there is a valvular involvement. You can probably hear there is an enlargement, so that means left atrial enlargement. Here pulmonary artery is full. All these things indicate that the patient has a multivalvular disease, and there is also some calcific spots here indicating a previous probably pulmonary tuberculosis, but I don't see any pleural effusions, so maybe it's an old tuberculosis with multivalvular involvement. A lot of information can be made and a suspicion can be made about a cardiac diagnosis when we look at an X-ray. So here again, we can see here there is some enlargement here, bump is there, probably it's a superior vena cava which is enlarged. And we can always discuss the differential diagnosis whenever an X-ray is given to you. Here there is a 70-year-old lady with coronary artery disease, and when the lady has pulmonary edema, you can see that hilar congestion is there. So it's very important to understand these X-rays. Here again, we think probably looks like some Eisenmenger kind of thing, large pulmonary artery dilatation. And here you have the dilatation of the right pulmonary artery. So there is a severe pulmonary hypertension in this X-ray. 60-year-old male chronic smoker on SOS inhalers comes to the OPD with acute dyspnea and cough, whitish sputum. He is unable to lie down comfortably. He has mild peripheral edema for years. SpO2 is 92, little bit on the lower side. Tachycardia and then tachypnea, chest bilateral bronchi are there. JVP is not elevated. Diagnosis is not clear. We need further investigations. So here it's not fitting into cardiac. You can see here is a chronic smoker on inhalers, and he has got bilateral extensive bronchi. Saturation is low, and he has cough with sputum. So clearly it's a COPD. There is no doubt about it. But how do you differentiate this? It's easy. You can differentiate it by clinical examination, then go for a chest X-ray or an echocardiography, which shows a normal LV function and normal valves. And lastly, we can resort to biomarkers. NT-proBNP is one of the best markers which can be done. If the NT-proBNP is elevated, then it suggests there is a heart failure. If the NT-proBNP is normal, it indicates a COPD. So with accuracy, you can differentiate by this blood test. So here, as I mentioned, you can see BNP was done, which is less than 100. So that means it is not cardiac congestion. It is a lung problem. So it's a COPD exacerbation. It's very clear. Again, I tell you, history is very important. Chronic smoker, previously on inhalers, and then there is a whitish sputum. On examination, you have bilateral bronchi, no crepitations. A cardiac failure patient may have bronchi and crepitations, but a COPD patient, generally they have bilateral bronchi. Sometimes they may have coarse crepitations. And clubbing is other thing. In COPD, you can see that the patients have clubbing, especially if they are chronic smokers. It's very easy to make it. Case 5 is 55-year-old female, overweight, dyspnea on effort, class 2 for past 1 year, worsening in 1 month, pedal edema, heart rate is 90, BP is normal, clear, normal heart sound, JVP is 0, chest is clear. So what could be the diagnosis in this lady? Overweight, dyspnea, and progressively increasing shortness of breath, mild pedal edema. So here again, you can differentiate various things. It could be related to the overweight. It could be related to the obstructive sleep apnea. Again, the workup in this lady includes a 2D echo and NT-proBNP. Based on that, you can differentiate. But as far as the given data shows, doesn't look like a cardiac problem. So thyroid is another thing which we can investigate in this lady. Now we will learn a little bit about the echocardiography, ventricular function. We will assess for the regional valve motion abnormality. We will assess for the ejection fraction. We will look at the stenosis or regurgitation of the valves, pericardial effusion or pericardial thickening and calcification, and then other thrombus in the chambers. Previously, if the patient has got a myocardial infarction, there may be a regional valve motion abnormality. There may be a LV aneurysm, and a thrombus can be there. In pulmonary arterial hypertension, we can make out by echocardiography. Echo is not only useful in assessing the anatomical problems, we can also assess the physiological problems like the stenosis or regurgitation. We can even make the measurement of pressures. We can measure the pulmonary hypertension. We can measure the left atrial pressure. There are so much information we can by looking at the echocardiography. So here you can see the chambers are dilated. There is a thin rim of pericardial effusion. Here is a representative 4-chamber echo. You can see this is left atrium, this is left ventricle, right atrium and right ventricle. Pericardial effusion, here is the aorta. This is the coronary sinus. So we can see a lot of structures also. So echocardiography, very importantly, we see end systolic dimension and diastolic dimension, and then peak TR velocity will give you the pulmonary hypertension. Ejection fraction can be calculated automatically, that will give, and we know what it is. Ejection fraction should be normally more than 50%. If it is below 50%, it is a LV dysfunction, we have already discussed. If it is 40 to 49, we call it as a mid-range ejection fraction. If it is below 40, it is a reduced ejection fraction. So we can look at the flow velocities across the valves, aortic, pulmonary, mitral, tricuspid. We can also make a diagnosis of a diastolic dysfunction by looking at the mitral inflows. So this is the classification of ejection fraction. Many times the technicians and doctors are reporting whatever they want. because there are two things. One is what the machine gives, the other is what the doctor sees by his eyes. And always there should be differentiation of what we write. Otherwise, they are writing severe as 30 or 40 and writing severe LV dysfunction. That is not correct. So we have clear-cut numbers. Mild is 45 to 54, 50 you can say. Moderate is 30 to 45, and severe is 30 and below. So the definition of ejection fraction is stroke volume by end diastolic volume into 100. As you know, stroke volume is the difference between end diastolic volume and end systolic volume. So if you make it as a percentage of end diastolic volume, then you know the EF. And this is not an index of contractility, as it depends on many factors like volume, preload, afterload, and heart rate. It just gives an indirect value that it is okay or not. The ventricle is able to eject. And here we have the diastolic dysfunction assessment. And there are many ways of assessing it. We do it by using the Doppler. Normally the early mitral pattern is more when compared to the late. That is E by I ratio we take. And LA volume index also we do, it is more than 34. And this is called tissue Doppler imaging. It's again for the echocardiographers to assess. E prime and A, we take it. E by E prime, if it is more than 13, that indicates LV diastolic dysfunction. Next, we come to the biomarkers. The biomarkers are important. They are brain natriuretic peptides. Whenever the heart failure is occurring, the ventricular wall stress increases, and that increases the pro-BNP. The pro-BNP again is cleaved into BNP, active, and then anti-pro-BNP, which is non-active. That is, anti-pro-BNP means N-terminal of the pro-BNP, it is not active. And use of NP is recommended for ruling out HF, but not to establish the diagnosis. And it has got a 100% negative value. If the BNP is normal, then it shows that the patient has no heart failure. So even in emergency, if someone comes to you with a heart failure, you want to differentiate, just ask for a BNP. And if the BNP is normal, then the patient does not have a heart failure. That is the power or the negative predictive value, we call it. So the cutoffs are almost similar, but you have to remember that BNP can be falsely elevated. If the patient has got atrial fibrillation, it is not useful. In renal failure, it is not useful. In obese people, it may be slightly higher. And in elderly people also, it may be increased. So both BNP and anti-pro-BNP can be used in heart failure. BNP and prognosis. BNP level also is important for assessing the prognosis. Not only it is good for making a diagnosis, but also assessing the treatment benefit and prognosis. This is very important because the BNP is very high at the time of admission. That indicates 4 times more mortality to the patient within a period of 180 days. So it's very important to know about it. And there are cutoff values. BNP 100 and anti-pro-BNP is 300. And BNP 35 here and 125 here. Almost 4 times you can see in non-acute settings and acute settings. As I mentioned, AF, old age, renal failure, accuracy is not there, and obesity also. And ornithotherapy, anti-pro-BNP to be used as BNP levels are increased by orni. So BNP is actually a beneficial thing, brain natriuretic peptide, because it produces natriuresis. So it excretes the volume. Other biomarkers are there called troponins, then soluble ST2 and galactins. Of course, we are not using the other things, but HS troponin also has got some value. Troponin can be used. Best is to use a multi-marker strategy, BNP, galactin 3, ST2, but again, cost it goes up when you use multiple biomarkers. But the science is science. Science comes with a price when you try to implement in the public life. So there is a HFA-PEF program for the diagnosis of HFpEF. This is initial workup, then diagnostic workup, advanced workup, and etiological workup. And I think the treatment is similar for all that. So if the patient is breathless, then rule out cardiac or non-cardiac, then do a clinical assessment, and then go ahead, and finally you can confirm the heart failure with preserved ejection fraction by looking at the BNP values and also by echo. So how do you manage heart failure? There is a lot of history about management of heart failure. If you are interested in the history, you can trace back right from the days of Lanoxin, which is more than 200-year-old drug. Still, I use it in my practice. It is called as a cardiotonic. And right from there, you can trace the history of heart failure therapy. So case is 55-year-old female attending OPD, 4 months of dyspnea on effort, 10 years diabetes, hypertension, hypothyroidism, effort-related dyspnea, gradual onset 4 months, now worsening to class 3. I think this is a similar case, which was shown earlier, diabetic or ischemic cardiomyopathy. And you can see here that there is a ST elevation in V1 to V4 with biphasic T waves. And Q waves are there in 3 and AVIA. So all these points out that there is a MI underlying. BNP is 1100, which is elevated. Echo shows dilated LV. 65 and 50 means it is dilated. Moderate LV dysfunction is there. Creatinine has gone up. Sodium and potassium are normal. So in summary, you have a patient with the diabetes, hypertension, hypothyroidism with moderate LV dysfunction, probably ischemic origin. How do you manage this case? So inferior MI, anterior MI, and you can see RWMA. Then the patient should have an angiogram. We will see whether we can revascularize because that can improve the condition. In this case, the LAD was found to have a lesion, stented. Other results for diffusely diseased, they left for medical management. Risk factor modification is important. Smoking cessation, moderate quantity of alcohol, and maintain blood sugars, very important. And then body weight should be seen. And the latest information is about the iron deficiency. So traditionally, we are trained to look at the hemoglobin and see whether the patient is having anemia or not. Now we have more information that hemoglobin alone is not enough. We have to treat iron deficiency. That is very important, especially in a heart failure. There is a lot of data and a lot of trials have shown that if you replace iron, the patients will improve. So not just going by hemoglobin, we have to do what is called transferrin and ferritin, transferrin saturation and ferritin. So ferritin below 100 and transferrin saturation below 20 indicates that we should give IV iron therapy, and the patients with a heart failure develop symptomatic improvement, and also walking time, everything improves. Dietary advice is very important. Sodium intake 2 grams per day, that is less than 5 grams, is very, very, very important. In our society, we have to educate them about the sodium intake. I had one patient long ago when I was working in that Pamanini hospital, a heart failure patient regularly coming to us and quite stable on treatment. And during the summertime, for 1 month, he did not come for follow-up. And then he landed to the OPD with a huge swollen legs and shortness of breath and puffy face and everything. So immediately I had to admit him. And then I asked him, have you stopped the medication? He said, no, doctor, I am taking the medications. But my children are in US and my wife has prepared the mango pickles. And I had to taste the mango pickles and also attempted to eat those mango pickles. For last 1 month, I am regularly eating, and also we have sent it by courier to our children in the US. So because of that salt cheating or salt excess, this patient has landed with a ADHF, that is acute decompensated heart failure. So this social aspect is also important. You have to assess this and also tell them not to be tempted and eat these pickles and all, especially now it's the summer season. The people will have the new mango pickle. In South India, it's a very, very famous, or I can say very much liked item in the food. This is the first thing. And second thing is they have to be very compliant about the medication. These two things are very important. And any occult infection or fever, other things can also precipitate the heart failure. So maybe we should touch upon a little bit later on about what factors precipitate heart failure. That is also very important. And we have to educate the patients. that they should pay attention to these things. And fluid restriction is also important. 1.5 to 2 liters may be considered good. If the patient has renal failure, we have to restrict it even less to 1 liter or so. But heart failure, 1.5 to 2 is okay. Physical activity, exercise training, they can do a little bit. No evidence that it should be limited to any particular HF patient. As tolerated, the patient should be active and do an exercise. And when you come to the pharmacological managements, there are two disease-modifying agents, beta blockers, ACE inhibitors, and MRAs, class 1A indication, and symptom relief is by diuretics. When the patient has got a history of MI, all these things are a must. LV dysfunction, use clinical judgment when deciding which drug to start first, titrate to the maximum tolerated doses. So it is our choice. We can start any of the drugs. There was previously a very big debate whether beta blocker should be started first or ACE inhibitor or ARB. Now it's okay, you can start anything. Within the first 24 hours, both these drugs should be on board unless they are severely contraindicated. ACE inhibitors, previously we had a captopril, which is a short-acting 6.25 TID. Next came enalapril 2.5 or up to 10 to 20 BID is the target dose. Lisinopril is a single therapy, 5 milligram, up to 20 you can give. Ramipril is again OD, 2.5 up to 10 OD. Phenylketopril is not available. So what we have here is captopril, enalapril, lisinopril, and ramipril. Any of them can be used. These are ACE inhibitors. So when you treat the patient with ACE inhibitors, you check the renal function and serum electrolytes. And then better to initiate once the patients are not hypovolemic. And also monitor the urine output. That is very, very important. And start at a low dose, followed by gradual titration. And always these drugs should be titrated to the maximum dose. So generally there is a physician inertia, including myself, because the patient acceptance also goes away. When you say in first visit, you start him on a 2.5, and subsequently you make it 5 and then make it 10, the patient fails to understand. He thinks that his disease has worsened and therefore you are giving high dose. And there is somehow a reluctance on the patient's point of view to take a high dose, and even the pharmacist may change the medication. He says this is a high dose, why you are taking 10 milligram? Or our other colleague or who sees the patient, a family physician, may try to dissuade the patient from taking a high dose. But always remember, in a heart failure, these patients should take maximum tolerated dose that is fixed by a physician or a cardiologist. Don't try to suddenly decrease the dose or stop those drugs, because the patient can land with the ADHF. So titration should be gradually done over a period of 1 to 2 weeks, and we have to monitor creatinine. If it is rising up 50% of the baseline or less than 3, it is acceptable. If it is more than that, then we have to hold the ACE inhibitor. The potassium, again, if it is more than 5.5, decrease the dose. If it is very high, more than 6, you have to stop the ACE inhibitor. So the most important side effect with the ACE inhibitor is cough. It's a dry cough. The patient will describe some throat sticking sensation, and then a dry cough, especially more common in the nighttime. And these patients should be alerted, and we have to tell them that this is a side effect. Otherwise, they will go to pulmonologist. I have a patient who went to pulmonologist, and he went up, did the X-rays, then subsequently he did all the immunology profile, allergy profile. Subsequently, he did a HRCT, the cough continued. Then he did a bronchoscopy, which was normal. And finally, he said, I am not able to find any cause for your cough. And the patient came back to me with all those investigations. He said, sir, I am having cough. Never I'm getting relief. Every day night I am having chronic cough last 2 months. I went to pulmonologist, all the investigation done, including bronchoscopy. I just asked him, what is the medication? Please give me the list. And he said he was on ramipril. So ramipril was a culprit. I told him, just, you forgot. I mentioned to you that you can have a cough as a side effect. And then he said, sorry, sir, I didn't remember. I was panicked and I went on from the specialist to specialist. So always these two things important. Cough is an important side effect of ACE inhibitor. Also remember that ARB also can present with a cough. Not only ACE inhibitor. With ACE inhibitors, 20%. With ARBs, like a telmisartan or olmesartan, valsartan, they also produce cough. The mechanism is bradykinin mediated, substance P. These are the agents that are degraded by ACE, and they accumulate in the upper respiratory tract or lungs when the enzyme is inhibited, and they may stimulate the cough. So ACE inhibitor ARB can produce cough. Please remember, if the patient has a cough, try to give antitussives. If it doesn't improve, then change the drug. And hypotension, hyperkalemia, and rising creatinine are the other side effects which you should know. All right. So it may start anytime, resolves 1 to 4 weeks, and most effective method is cessation of ACE inhibitor, switch over to ARB, but that also can produce cough. Please remember and consider rechallenging. I don't think we do this rechallenging business. Once you stop the drug, it is the end of the story. You go for other alternatives. So candesartan, valsartan, and losartan are the 3 drugs that are approved in heart failure. Don't use telmisartan for heart failure patient, please. Candesartan is not available. Valsartan is available, which is a good drug. Losartan, which is a very good drug with the least side effects. Definitely, it can be a choice in people with a heart failure. Now we have the new concept called ORNI, that is valsartan sacubitril combination, that is angiotensin receptor blocker, neprilysin inhibitor. It is available at 50, 100, 200. Initiate 50 BD and then maximally titrate to 200. If the patient is on ACE inhibitor, stop for 24 hours, and then you can start this. Monitor NT-proBNP. This is revolutionized. It's one of the best drugs to be used in patients with a heart failure. Even in acute heart failure, you can use this drug. It's available as a Vimada or Azmarda, or some more Indian brands are also available. We can use them. Paradigm HF is the trial which did a randomization into 2 groups. This is LCZ 696 is the other name or the compound name for the ORNI, that is neprilysin inhibitor with the ARB, that is sacubitril valsartan. Otherwise, we can say SAC-VAL. LCZ 696 compared to enalapril, the older drug for heart failure. And we can see here that there was a significantly lower primary endpoint of cardiovascular death and hospitalization for heart failure. Now next is beta blocker. Beta blocker therapy in heart failure demonstrated reductions in mortality, reduction in hospitalization for heart failure, and symptomatic improvement in NYHA class 2 to 4. And the life saved of 3.8, 4 few hospitalization for 100 patients, and target heart rate is less than 70 in sinus rhythm, 80 to 90 in atrial fibrillation. So beta blocker is one of the good drugs. It can be used. Bisoprolol is very good drug, 1.25 to 10 milligram. Carvedilol 3.125 to 25. We also have long-acting carvedilol also. Metoprolol succinate 25 or 200 OD. We can go. This is a BD also we use actually. Nebivolol is another drug, 1.25 and 10. So in my experience, these 3 are approved: bisoprolol, carvedilol, and metoprolol. They are good for heart failure. So it should be started at a low possible dose in patients before discharge once their congestion is relieved. When they are off inotropic support, it should be given along with ACE inhibitor or ARB. And when the patient reaches a satisfying dose or a tolerable dose, then you can stop it and double the dose every 2 weeks. The main important problem is the bradycardia or worsening of HF with the beta blockers, and beware in asthmatics and all, you have to use a selective beta blocker. Carvedilol is by far the best, otherwise marketed as the bisoprolol is by far the best, even for COPD people. Bisoprolol. Abrupt withdrawal should be avoided, and there is a more common with short-acting beta blockers than long-acting ones. And tapering can be done. Same dose as OD for 1 week, alternate day for 1 week, and stop. If it is a OD dose, then half the dose for 1 week, half dose alternate days, and for 1 week, and then stop. But generally, there is no need to withdraw them abruptly. Worsening of heart failure can be sometimes seen, and beta blocker can lead to worsening in the situation where the sympathetic drive is maintaining the output. Fatigue can be a problem. Hypotension and heart block, we have seen it can be a complication. Mineralocorticoid antagonists are again 1A approved drugs for the heart failure. We have 2 drugs. One is spironolactone, but unfortunately it produces a significant problem of gynecomastia. It's not tolerated by many people, and sometimes it's a tender gynecomastia, and also it is in males, it's unsightly, and people may be embarrassed to have large breasts. So I personally prefer to use eplerenone. Eplerenone is 25 milligram OD or BD dose. Maximal you can go to 50, and the side effect of gynecomastia is very less. So these are the two things. Eplerenone is my choice. Spironolactone is another because it's a cheaper. It can be used in some people. In women, of course, spironolactone doesn't produce much problem. It does not have an effect of increasing the size. In men, it produces gynecomastia. So there is no head-to-head comparison. Gynecomastia, pain in the breast, 10% more with the spironolactone. With eplerenone, it is 1%. So it is better. As I already mentioned, it is cheaper. Spironolactone is cheaper. Diuretics are important when the patient is fluid overloaded. It's better to start the patient on diuretic. We have many of those drugs: furosemide, torsemide, then thiazides, metolazone, indapamide, spironolactone, amiloride, triamcinolone. All these drugs are available. Potassium sparing also, and most commonly and most effectively used is furosemide, otherwise called Lasix. Then we have the torsemide or Ditor. We have combination also of these drugs. Lacilactone, we have, for example, furosemide with spironolactone. We have Ditor plus, that means torsemide plus spironolactone. And any of these agents are okay to be used. The metolazone can be remembered for refractory cases. It is a very good drug actually, and very powerful. Produces a lot of diuretics, and it can be given weekly, twice, etc. Also, if the patient is going into electrolyte imbalance. So the most common electrolyte imbalance is low sodium. It can be mild, moderate, or severe. You have to beware of the hyponatremia, especially in elderly people. And thiazides cause maximum 72%, potassium sparing is 20%, and loop diuretics 8%. So if you see here, loop diuretic does not cause much of hyponatremia, and those people need to be supplemented with new drugs called tolvaptan. You can add it. It also helps in people who have overloaded and with hyponatremia. Fluid restriction should be done. If it is very symptomatic, below 125, and then a correction of hypertonic saline should be made. And then, as I mentioned, tolvaptan is the vasopressin receptor antagonist. It can be started 15 milligram OD and can be continued BD, and for 1 month or 2 months, it can be given. Now, combination drugs, ACE inhibitor, beta blocker, and MRA. If the patient is symptomatic and less than 35, we can give Orni to replace it. And then if it is in sinus rhythm, QRS duration more than 130, evaluate the need for the resynchronization therapy, CRT. If it is in sinus rhythm, heart rate is still more than that, we can add ivabradine. Is another drug which reduces the heart rate, acts on the sinus node. And in heart failure, remember, if you maintain the heart rate about 70, the patient is very good. So ivabradine is a drug which is a IF channel blocker. It slows the heart rate. If the patient's heart rate is high despite beta blockers, then you can add a 5 milligram or 7.5 milligram OD or BD. It's a very good drug. Our digoxin is an older drug I mentioned, which is very helpful. The patient has got resistant symptoms. Better to give digoxin, but we have to remember that these patients should not have renal failure, and if they have a hepatic dysfunction, you can still give it, but in renal dysfunction, it's a no, because it can cause digitoxicity, and all sorts of arrhythmias can come because of digitoxicity. And another drug that is useful is isosorbide dinitrate hydrolyzine combination, and it can be also used. So medically, we are not considering going for LVAD or transplantation in many of these people. There you can supplement digoxin. That is helpful. So digoxin, this is the picture of the digoxin, the plant. It's a plant-based alkaloid, and it can be useful. The other drugs we can use is statins and anticoagulants in AF. Statins, they are given, but as such for heart failure, there is not much of role. And here we have the new drugs called SGLT2 inhibitors, which are the diabetic drugs. And DAPA-HF trial has shown half of them were non-diabetics. In them, it has shown reduction in the hospitalization for heart failure. And so people are saying that it may be also a good drug to be considered in heart failure, especially if they're diabetic. If they're not diabetic, still we are experimenting and trying in some people. I think with the time, we may develop more experience. So if the patient cannot tolerate ACE inhibitor or ARB, what to do in them? So I mentioned that there is a drug called hydrolysine isosorbide dinitrate combination. This drug can be used safely. So hydrolysine 37.5 is added, and the Lasix is about, the nitrate is about 20. So 37.5 and 20, it can be given 3 times. There is a fixed dose combination. It's available as isolazine, and it is also one of our favorite drugs in people who have elevated creatinine where you are unable to give ACE inhibitor or ARB. So GDMT we talked about includes ACE inhibitor, ARB or ARNI, any of them. But now the first choice is ARNI, then a beta blocker, and MRA, especially eplerenone. It improves the mortality. But only 25 to 35 patients receive this therapy because the cost is expensive. But however, hospitalization cost is much more expensive and associated with the trauma and stress to the family and also patient. So better to stay away from getting admitted. And therefore, though they are expensive, I prefer to use those medications to the patients. Now we come to the device therapy. We have implantable cardiac defibrillator, because these patients with the heart failure are prone to sudden cardiac deaths. And data shows that half of them can have a sudden cardiac event in the form of a ventricular tachycardia or a ventricular fibrillation. And you don't have time in many of these people to bring them to hospital and then give a defibrillator, because within 3 minutes to 5 minutes, if you don't shock them, they're going to go into a brain damage. And even within the time, if you're trying to do it, the patient will be brain dead and he is unable to come out. So therefore, in these people, it is better to implant a defibrillator. And it has been shown to be useful in severe LV dysfunction people. And CRT is the resynchronization therapy, where there is a pacing done to the right ventricle and then right atrium and also coronary sinus. And this is also associated with pacing function and tachycardia, anti-tachycardia function. So it's one of the good devices to be implanted, but it's very expensive, about 12 lakhs, 10 to 12 lakhs. So people may not be able to afford. And secondary prevention of sudden cardiac death, all the guidelines recommend ICD, that is implantable cardiac defibrillator, irrespective of the ejection fraction. But generally people who have less than 35 or 40%, they may be benefiting from the implantable cardiac defibrillator. So CRT is also important to know if the patient has got a LBB morphology, which indicates a ventricular dysynchrony, then a CRT should be implanted. This is a cardiac resynchronization therapy. We have the RV lead, right atrial lead, and LV lead, which is placed into the coronary sinus. And it also has got, I mentioned, pacing and anti-tachycardia function. So class 1 recommendation is for those who have EF less than 35, LBB with a QRS duration of more than 150, and NOH a class 2 or 3. CRT-P means only pacing, CRT-D means pacing and also defibrillation. I think when we are going for a device, it is better to go for a CRT-D. Only pacing is not enough. Defibrillation, as I mentioned, sudden cardiac death always is a risk. And sometimes surgical therapy is also there. CABG can be done. Stitch trial is where the ventricular remodeling is done. You chop off the ventricle a little bit and then decrease the size of the ventricle so that the volume is less, and diastolic volume is less and systolic volume is less, and the heart may be able to pump better. This is one of the trials that is done. And valvular repairs are also coming now. Mitral valve repair percutaneously also. The clips are implanted. Mitral clip is another thing in heart failure. And then percutaneous valve replacement therapy is also coming for aortic valve and also mitral. We are also doing this aortic valve percutaneous, but again, it is very expensive, 25 to 30 lakhs, but it helps. Cardiac transplantation is the last thing. Cadaveric transplantation is an active program here in our Telangana state, and we have a cardiac transplant surgeon as well in the group. And dilated cardiomyopathy people who are refractory to therapy, they can be definitely taken up for this. Affordability again is a problem, but the hospital is trying to help them. The cost is about 20 lakhs to 25 lakhs. Median survival in the West is 11 years, 1 year survival 85, 10 year survival is 60% Australian data. Previously, I told you 10 year survival 10%, with the transplantation it is 60%. But in India, of course, I think we don't have much of data. I think it is discouraging because immunosuppression and follow-up is very important. Unfortunately, here we don't have a dedicated cardiac transplantation specialist, as well as the physicians are not interested because the program has not picked up much. Case study, 70-year-old female, hypertensive, dyspnea, admitted with worsening, LVH on ECG, good systolic function, BNP 700, high blood pressure. So I think LVH on ECG, echo is showing normal LV function, presenting with dyspnea. That means it is a heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. Unfortunately, the treatment options are not much for HFpEF. We have very few drugs. The spironolactone is one of the things that can be helpful. And then a kind of beta blocker is shown to be beneficial, that is nebivolol. Other than that, we don't have much of the drugs. Diuretics can be given if the patient is volume overloaded. So this is the diagnosis, symptoms and signs. LV of more than 50% is very important because the preserved ejection fraction means more than 50. Elevated level of NP is important, and we should have LVH. And also I mentioned about the echocardiographic parameters. We can do the Doppler studies and establish the diagnosis of diastolic dysfunction. So the trials have shown no big benefit actually. Aldosterone blocker, that is spironolactone, not much, but in some patients may be beneficial. CRT is no benefit. Orni trial is going on Paragon, but in women it showed benefit. Beta blockers, nebivolol I showed can be used. Control of risk factors, especially hypertension, decongestive measures, optimizing ventricular filling, and treatment of myocardial ischemia. These are the things to be done. Control of blood pressure, diuretics, and 2B is AF if the patient has converted to sinus rhythm by drugs or by shock. Digoxin again, no role. ADHF means acute decongested heart failure. Here, 35-year-old male attending casualty, dyspnea of 2 days, worsening, admitted with severe dyspnea, tachycardia 110, tachypnea 24, bilateral collapse, myocarditis, ventricular dysfunction, pulmonary edema. I think we have seen this case in the beginning. This is a ADHF. Those who present first time without knowing that they have a cardiac problem, and those who know that they have a heart problem, improved and came back, like the one who ate the pickles in the story which I mentioned. And these are the two kinds of ADHFs. Goal is hemodynamic stabilization, improve the oxygen and ventilation, normalizing the fluid status, and improve the cardiac output. Identifying the etiological factors, reverse the ventricular remodeling and improve the ventricular function. CAD, eminently treatable. Valvular heart disease, you can do a valvotomy, send them for a valve repair or replacement. If there is a myocarditis, then treatment with immunosuppressives is helpful. Alcoholic cardiomyopathy is one of the common problems, but fortunately, it's a totally reversible condition. If the person stops taking alcohol, within 6 months, he will become all right. And chemotherapy-induced cardiomyopathy, there are some protective drugs to be used, and we have to give cumulative dose should be calculated of these chemotherapeutic drugs, and we have to work in tandem with the oncologist, medical oncologist, and then do the periodic echo reviews. So ADHF should be monitored in ICU. The routine protocols are in place, and then different parameters should be monitored, as you know, fluid restriction, salt restriction, all those things. And pharmacological therapy is IV Lasix. So one of the important things is to put them on IV Lasix. If the blood pressure is better, IV nitroglycerin also helps. If the cardiac contractility is low, then inotropic support in the form of dobutamine or dopamine will help. And sometimes drugs like milrinone or levosimendan, they're all inotropes. They can be given. I mean, gives a lot of satisfaction when someone with the ADHF is, treated and goes home. So these are the drugs. IV Lasix can be given. Then we go up to 5 milligram per hour infusion, and sometimes 10 milligram per hour also can be given. And the patient will become euvolemic in no time, and their urinary output increases from 3 to 5 liters per day. So if they have a hypotension, then give dopamine and dobutamine, etc. Those things should be given. These are the inotropes: dopamine, dobutamine, milrinone, enoxamin, levosimendan, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. Here in our routine practice, we use dobutamine, dopamine, milrinone is available, levosimendan is available, norepinephrine, epinephrine, all these things are available. The doses generally dopamine and dobutamine 5 to 20 micrograms per kg per minute. Milrinone is 0.375 to 0.75. Levosimendan is 0.1 mics. And norepinephrine is 0.1, 0.2 to 1. Epinephrine is half of that, 0.05 to 0.5. And these things can be calculated and then put into infusion pumps, and we do it. Inotropes, they are for short term, they are better, but long term, there is no benefit. Dobutamine is a first line agent if the SBP is between 70 and 100 in the absence of signs and symptoms of shock. Dopamine is added if the patient has low blood pressure. Combination of dopamine, dobutamine is definitely beneficial. Milrinone is very good, but hypotension can be there. The problem with them is, again, the arrhythmias can happen, VT, etc. So we have to be very careful. And the other things like mechanical circulatory supports are there, ventricular assist devices, and then extracorporeal membrane oxygenator, which is implanted by the surgeon. IABP is done by the cardiologist. These are all temporary measures. Mechanical circulatory supports, they will only help the patient to come out. The cost is expensive. If you look at the LVAD, it is about 60 to 80 lakhs, which is, I think, beyond anyone's scope. Number 5 case, 60-year-old male, known case of CAD ischemic cardiomyopathy, discharged after stabilization. Was doing okay 6 months, then again with ADHF. How to go about this patient? Drug compliance is very important. I mentioned very few people are very compliant about the drug, and also diet, fluid restriction. All these things are very important. Actually, in Western countries, we have the nurse practitioners, NPs. They are very knowledgeable, and they handle all the phone calls, and they also adhere to the patient. What is his weight on the particular day? What kind of medication he is taking? And they have the flexibility to adjust the dose as well. Unfortunately, in our country, we don't have that nurse practitioner system, and doctor is responsible for all the questions that are shot by the patient. So precipitating factors are important: drug discontinuation, and then salt and fluid dysregulation are important. Usage of NSAIDs and the other drugs, cancer therapy, and then anemia, occult GA bleed, etc. Infections, atrial fibrillation, alcohol abuse, myocardial depression, all these things can cause ADHF. So all people being admitted with suspected acute heart failure have an early and continuing input from a dedicated specialist, and discharge plan should be there. And GDMT, whether it is done or not, we have to check. And this is about the various kinds of managements. And what is the long-term management? We already touched base a little bit about the long-term management. Assess the symptoms, and then body weight, heart rate, etc., fluid status, drug compliance, monitor his renal parameters, hemoglobin, etc., and rising burden of heart failure in India and the whole world. And most of our Indians have out-of-pocket health spending, which is also a very gruesome fact in our country. And we have to beware and start proper treatment without patient getting admitted into hospitals. HF is an emerging problem. It continues to go, and any cause can finally lead to heart failure. Pharmacological management, the new drugs are there, they have to be given, and the patient can be given the options like permanent solutions, like LVADs or heart transplant, etc. At least as a physician, we have to educate them. I think with this, we come to the conclusion of our 11th module. I am glad that we could make out, despite so many problems.